Something is breaking, and most Americans have no idea it's happening in real time. Right now, in the spring of 2026, the world is entering a period of convergence that historians will look back on decades from now and point to as the moment the old order cracked wide open. The United States national security strategy itself has already declared it openly. The days of the United States propping up the entire world order like Atlas are over. Think about what that actually means. The most powerful government on the planet just told you in writing that the era you grew up in is finished. And yet most Americans are still sleeping through the alarm. What you are watching right now is not a news cycle. It is not a diplomatic spat. It is not political theater between Washington and Beijing. What you are watching is the structural collapse of a 70-year geopolitical arrangement, and two crises, one in Asia and one in the Middle East, are happening simultaneously that will determine what comes next. China's warning to the United States is not the same warning Beijing has issued before. This one is backed by hardware, by economic leverage, by military confidence, and by the knowledge that America is overextended, distracted, and caught between two world-shaking fires at once. And Israel, the crown jewel of Washington's Middle East strategy, is showing cracks inside its own military, inside its own government, and inside its own economy that no amount of American weapons or political cover can fully paper over. This is the moment. This is the convergence. And if you want to understand what is really happening, not the headlines, not the spin, not the talking points, then stay right here because this conversation matters. Let us start with China because you have to understand the baseline before you can understand why what Beijing is doing right now is different in kind, not just in degree, from anything we have seen in recent memory. For decades, the relationship between Washington and Beijing operated on a certain understood grammar. China would assert, America would respond, both would find some managed equilibrium, and the world would keep turning. That grammar is now gone. What is emerging in 2026 is a fundamentally different dynamic, one where China is using America's own deliberate retreat from strategic competition to quietly advance its position economically, technologically, and geopolitically, with Washington apparently either unwilling or unable to stop it. Let that land for a moment. We are not talking about China sneaking something past a distracted America. We are talking about Beijing making calculated strategic moves in plain sight, while Washington is busy negotiating trade deals and planning summit meetings. China's shipbuilding capacity is now reported to be 230 times that of the United States. They have more than doubled their nuclear-powered submarine construction. Their arsenal of ballistic and cruise missiles is undergoing what military analysts describe as a rapid expansion. Their nuclear stockpile is growing faster than any other nation on Earth. And they are not just building ships and missiles. They are building an entirely new kind of military, one designed around artificial intelligence, drone swarms, and what Beijing calls intelligentized warfare. These are not theoretical capabilities sitting in research labs. The U.S. Indo-Pacific Command has already warned that China's military activity is increasingly resembling preparation for real conflict, not just posturing. Read that sentence again. The United States' own military commanders in the Pacific are telling Congress that what China is doing looks less like intimidation and more like preparation. That is not nothing. That is a 5-alarm fire. And then there is the economic dimension of China's warning, which may actually be more consequential in the long run than any military buildup. Beijing has warned every trading partner on the planet not to succumb to American pressure to isolate China's economy, framing the choice with sharp and deliberate language. Appeasement does not bring peace, and compromise does not earn respect. That is not the language of a country playing defense. That is the language of a rising power that believes it now holds sufficient leverage to dictate the terms of the global economic conversation. And it is working. Xi Jinping spent the early part of 2025 touring Southeast Asia, building alliances, signing cooperation agreements, and positioning China as the steady hand in a world that America's tariff chaos has made unpredictable. Even as Xi launched his economic charm offensive, Beijing did not step back from its military assertiveness, conducting live fire drills near Australia and New Zealand, continuing aggression against the Philippines in the South China Sea, and maintaining constant pressure on Taiwan. That is the combination that makes China's current posture so uniquely dangerous. They are smiling at the world with one hand and holding a loaded gun with the other. Now let's talk about Taiwan, because it is the pressure point where everything could ignite. In December 2025, China conducted its largest military exercises around Taiwan since 2022, a two-day simulation of a full military blockade involving rockets, assault ships, and bombers encircling the island in what Beijing called Justice Mission 2025. They were not ambiguous about what this was. It was a message, it was a demonstration, and it was a test of American resolve, a test of whether Washington would blink, and a test of how the rest of the world would react. Beijing's own internal think tanks have already identified Taiwan tensions as the #1 geopolitical risk of 2026, warning that a potential three seas linkage across the East China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, and the South China Sea could trigger chain reactions at unprecedented levels. This is China's own analysts speaking. They are not downplaying the danger, they are mapping it. China's defense spending has been committed to increase by 7% in 2026, bringing its total military budget to approximately $277 billion. And China's overall defense spending is estimated to be around 11 times that of Taiwan. 11 times, not double, not triple. 11 times the defense capacity of the island it intends to eventually absorb. And the United States, for all its talk about deterrence, is in the middle of a diplomatic dance with Beijing that has some of Washington's most seasoned strategic thinkers deeply alarmed. The Trump administration agreed to sell NVIDIA's advanced H200 chips to Beijing, removed National Security Council staffers who had advocated for greater technology controls toward China, and left discussion of Beijing as a strategic rival out of both the national security strategy and the national defense strategy. You heard that correctly. The documents that are supposed to define America's strategic posture for the coming years do not describe China as a strategic rival. At the very moment China is building the most powerful military it has ever had, Washington is pulling the language of competition out of its own guiding documents. This is the context in which China's latest warning must be understood. Now shift your gaze to the Middle East, because Israel's situation is equally sobering and equally misunderstood by most American audiences. The narrative that has dominated American media for the past 2.5 years has been one of Israeli strength, Israeli resilience, and Israeli victory. And on a tactical level, there is truth in that. Israel has delivered devastating military blows across multiple fronts. But what is happening now beneath the surface of that military machine tells a very different story about sustainability, about limits, and about what happens when a country fights on every front simultaneously without a clear path to ending any of them. Israel's own IDF Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Eyal Zamir, reportedly warned the Security Cabinet directly, raising what he described as 10 red flags, stating that before long, the IDF will not be ready for its routine missions and that the reserve system will not hold. This is not a critic of the Israeli government. This is the man who runs the Israeli military, speaking to the people who make the decisions about war and peace. And what he said was essentially this: we cannot keep doing what we are doing. The Israeli Defense Forces, one of the most battle-hardened militaries on the planet, is telling its own civilian leadership that it is approaching a breaking point. The IDF has been operating with a shortage of 12,000 troops since the war in Gaza began, while approximately 80,000 ultra-Orthodox men between the ages of 18 and 24 remain eligible for military service but have not enlisted. And here is the political ugliness underneath that military crisis. The coalition government that Netanyahu leads depends on the ultra-Orthodox parties for its survival, and those parties have made protecting their communities from the draft a non-negotiable condition of their political support. So Israel finds itself in a position where its military chief is pleading for more soldiers, and its prime minister cannot deliver them without destroying his own government. That is not a tactical problem. That is a structural crisis. The economic dimensions of Israel's situation compound the military ones in ways that rarely get discussed honestly in American media. Israel's central government fiscal balance swung from a surplus of 0.6% of GDP in 2022 to a deficit of 6.8% in 2024, driven by surging defense spending and weaker revenue across the board. The public debt has climbed from a comparatively manageable 60% of GDP before the war to a projected 70.5% by the end of 2026. Netanyahu is planning to add $116 billion to the defense budget over the next decade, which would amount to a steep 6% of GDP devoted entirely to defense spending. Think about what that means for a modern democratic society. When you put that proportion of your economic output into military spending year after year, something else has to give. Infrastructure, healthcare, education, innovation, the very civilian economy that generates the tax revenue to pay for the military in the first place. It is a cycle that has broken nations before, and Israel is not immune to the same arithmetic that has humbled every other state that tried to sustain permanent warfare indefinitely. By December 2025, 53% of member firms in Israel's High-Tech Business Association reported a rise in relocation requests, meaning skilled Israelis are increasingly asking to be moved to positions in Europe or the United States. This matters enormously, and not just economically. Israel's military depends on a reserve system that draws heavily from the same educated, skilled population that works in its world-class technology sector. The Bank of Israel itself has acknowledged that the war's impacts are visible across all industries, with declines in credit card expenditure, a collapse in tourism, and serious disruptions to labor supply due to employee absences and reserve call-ups, alongside fractures in supply chains. This is the real texture of what prolonged multi-front warfare does to a society, not the dramatic missile strikes or the battlefield footage, but the slow grinding erosion of the civilian foundation that makes a modern military possible. And all of this is happening while Israel is simultaneously managing the political fallout of its campaign in Gaza, its confrontation with Iran, its shattered ceasefire arrangement with Lebanon, and a coalition government that is held together by contradictions so severe that the budget nearly collapsed because of a dispute over funding for religious institutions at the very moment that reserve soldiers are watching their businesses fail back home. The tension between Israel's burden-bearing middle class and the sectors of society less integrated into either the labor force or the military is, by multiple accounts, reaching a genuine boiling point. That is a social fracture. That is the kind of internal pressure that makes external military operations harder to sustain, that makes political decisions more erratic, and that makes the entire enterprise more fragile than any front-page story about Israeli military strength would suggest. Now, here's the connection that most American commentators are failing to make clearly. The convergence of China's boldness and Israel's strain is not a coincidence. It is a reflection of a single underlying reality, which is that American power has limits. Those limits are now visible to every actor on the global stage, and every actor is adjusting their behavior accordingly. Pentagon officials have told Congress that their strategy is to make any Chinese attack on Taiwan infeasible, and that the United States must rebuild military capacity and maintain credible deterrence as global threats expand, all while acknowledging that the U.S. cannot counter China's military rise alone and is pressing allies to spend 3.5% of their GDP on defense. Read the subtext of that. The United States is asking its allies to spend more on their own defense because Washington understands at the institutional level that the old arrangement, where America underwrites everyone's security and projects power everywhere simultaneously, is no longer viable. The Stimson Center has described the current global moment as a protracted interregnum, still unsettled, still fragmenting, with the old neoliberal rules-based architecture decomposing, power diffusing, and much of the world searching for new multilateral arrangements to act as a buffer against what it calls three predatory revisionist major powers. That is not fringe analysis. That is mainstream strategic thinking from one of Washington's own respected institutions. The world is reorganizing. The question is not whether the old order is ending. It clearly is. The question is what replaces it, who shapes it, and whether the United States is going to be an architect of the new arrangement or a casualty of its own inability to adapt. What China understands with cold strategic clarity is that America's greatest vulnerability right now is not military, it is political. It is the inability of Washington to sustain coherent long-term strategy across multiple theaters simultaneously when its own domestic politics are volatile, its alliances are under strain, and its economic model is being challenged in ways that no tariff war will resolve. The central risk of the current moment is that China is using America's own deliberate time out from strategic competition to position itself for a future where it has surpassed the United States, not through a single dramatic confrontation, but through the steady, patient accumulation of advantages across economics, technology, and geopolitics. That is the Chinese approach. That has always been the Chinese approach, and it is working. Meanwhile, Israel, for all its military innovation and economic resilience, is facing something that no amount of American diplomatic cover can fully protect it from: the exhaustion of its own people, the fracturing of its own society, the unsustainable arithmetic of permanent warfare, and the slow erosion of its international standing at precisely the moment it needs maximum support to sustain maximum military pressure across maximum fronts. Israel's public debt is heading towards 70.5% of GDP by the end of 2026, with defense spending running at levels that will weigh on the economy through growing debt and either higher taxes or lower civilian spending for years to come. These are not alarmist projections. These are the numbers coming from Israel's own finance ministry, from the Bank of Israel, and from the International Monetary Fund. And they paint a picture of a country that has demonstrated extraordinary toughness, but is running up against the physical and financial limits of what any nation can sustain without a fundamental recalibration of strategy. The American people deserve to understand this clearly, without the fog of partisan cheerleading or the false comfort of official reassurance. What is unfolding right now is a genuine inflection point in world history. China is not bluffing. Israel is not invincible. American power is not unlimited. And the decisions being made right now in Beijing, in Tel Aviv, in Washington will shape the world that your children and grandchildren inherit. This is the moment to pay attention. This is the moment to think clearly, because what comes next will not wait for anyone to catch up.